Do you love movies? So do I. What's up, y'all? It's KB, and I love movies, inviting you to listen to The Conversation, a film podcast where passion meets perspective and opinion. From the old school to the new, I invite a guest on to discuss the movies that thrill us, challenge us, break our hearts, or even blow our minds. There's always new episodes dropping wherever you get your podcasts. So join the conversation. We don't just watch movies. We love talking about them too. The Conversation with KB Loves Movies, a part of Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
Hey, this is Jason Kleberg from the Force 5 podcast, a show that forces a guest to come up with a movie-themed top 5 list topic, and then we reveal our picks on air. Top 5 heist films, top 5 tearjerkers, top 5 movie dogs. Every show you'll be asking yourself, what would be on my list? Guests include directors, screenwriters, actors, podcasters, musicians, authors, and even a professional wrestler. Subscribe to the Force 5 podcast, and you won't just be a listener, you'll be a list nerd. The Force 5 podcast, available wherever you're listening now.
Too much brain and not enough guts.
Welcome to Wake Up Heavy, the world's greatest horror movie podcast.
Hello, I'm Mark Begley, and I'm here to invite you aboard the Wake Up Heavy podcast. Yes, it's true. Day-to-day living becomes a luxury cruise when you've made your home at Wake Up Heavy. Although downtown Montreal is only 2,976 miles away, once you've crossed the bridge to Wake Up Heavy, the noise and the traffic of the city might as well be a million miles away. Gracious hospitality is easy when you listen to Wake Up Heavy. They all come fully equipped with the most modern name-brand electrical appliances, and cable TV is standard too. Cruise the seasons, the sun, and the stars without ever leaving the great ship Wake Up Heavy. It's all here. A restaurant complete with takeout service, a variety store, delicatessen, boutique, drugstore, dry cleaning service. Sail through life in quiet and comfort. Cruise Wake Up Heavy. Studios, 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom apartments are now available from Starco, a division of General Structures Incorporated.
On this island, in this building, through this door, down this hallway, lies the most frightening experience of your life. Prepare yourself for They Came From Within. What are they? Raging demons that must be exorcised, bloodthirsty creatures that must be killed, or incarnations of absolute evil. They came from within. They possess men, women, and children, and drive them to acts of unbelievable horror. No one is safe from them. No power on earth can stop them. The only escape is death. They came from within. If this picture doesn't make you scream and squirm, you'd better see a psychiatrist. Quick. Rated R.
Hello, and welcome to Wake Up Heavy Recollections of Horror. This is Mark Begley, your host. Joining me once again from the Projection Booth podcast is the host with the most, Mike White.
Does this look like a rash to you?
This time on the show, Mike and I will be discussing the 1975 film Shivers, directed by David Cronenberg. The film stars Paul Hampton as Dr. Roger St. Luke, Lynn Laurie as Nurse Forsyth, Susan Petrie as Janine Tudor, Alan Coleman as Nick Tudor, and Barbara Steele as Betts, all residents of the luxury apartment complex Starliner Tower. The film also features the inimitable Joe Silver as Rollo Linsky. Dr. Emil Hobbs' experiments with helpful parasites has gone awry, and now the tenants of the Starliner are under attack by the polyamorous creatures. Can the residents of the Starliner stop the infection from spreading to nearby Montreal and beyond? Or do they even want to? Shivers introduced audiences and critics to a new kind of horror film and courted controversy not only for its subject matter, but also for its manner of funding. So Mike, when did you first see Shivers, and what did you think?
So I kind of came to Cronenberg a little backwards, possibly. I saw The Fly in theaters and then kind of stuck with him for his subsequent films a little bit. And then kind of started to go backwards in his filmography. Once I got to Videodrome, I just stuck with Videodrome for a long time, and I never watched anything else by him. Even Scanners, which I had seen a bunch of Scanners in the, what is the name of that horror compilation? Terror in the Isles, I think it might be. And I used to mix up Scanners with Brian De Palma film with John Cassavetes, which was very similar in that it had psychics in it, The Fury. I think it was probably a lot longer than I think it was. I think it was probably 10, 15 years ago that I finally went back and watched Scanners, watched Rabid, watched Shivers, and watched The Brood kind of in quick succession. And man, was I blown away. I was really happy to see those early Cronenbergs and especially to see how they informed the later Cronenbergs.
I have a similar experience. The Fly was kind of the kickoff point for me as well. I remember seeing, that was the first Cronenberg I saw in the theater. I was of age at the time to just go by myself, and had seen Scanners, much like you. That was kind of ubiquitous for that period of time, the early 80s, and VHS rentals, and everybody knew about the exploding head scene. And definitely saw The Dead Zone, but that was more because of the Stephen King connection. I liked both and watched both very often, but I don't think it was until The Fly and kind of realizing, whoa, this is a bit different than what I'm used to. And I think at that point I went back and started watching the early ones, and I don't know which came first. I confused Shivers and Rabid for years. I mean, up until probably 5 years ago even. And thinking which one was first, which one was the one that was called something different here in the States, who was in which one. But like you, was really struck by not only the threads that went through, the later Cronenberg that I was more familiar with, but also just kind of feeling really unnerved and unused to what I was seeing. It wasn't like the other horror films that I had been so in tune with at the time. And this wasn't supernatural horror. It wasn't a haunted house story. And it took me a long time to kind of realize what all of that was, how it was different and why it was different. But I just know that the differences are what kind of freaked me out about his movies for a long time.
It's interesting because you could cast this as a mad scientist movie, but the mad scientist is dead within the first 10 minutes of the film. So it's not like we have the man who's, giving life to Frankenstein's monster. It's not like we have the person who wants to sew together 3 people and make a human centipede. It's like those are the stars of those films. No matter how great Frankenstein's monster is, it is Dr. Frankenstein who holds that whole thing together. And here, like, we don't even know that our mad scientist is the mad scientist until well after he has sliced his own throat. And then we hear about the crime and finally realize, oh, he was the guy who came up with this idea. So it's like, this is the hell that he hath wrought after. This is like, 10 minutes after his movie ends is when this movie begins.
And that kind of figures into Rabid as well. I think in Scanners, the mad scientist lasts a bit longer, and then could even say that for The Brood as well. And I think that was one of the things that really struck me the first time I saw Shivers, was that opening scene with that faux commercial to start us off with, and oh, isn't this nice, and this lovely cruise ship away from the city, and we have this couple show up to be shown apartments by the wonderful Ronald Mlodzik. That is immediately intercut with the Emil Hobbs and Annabelle Brown scene, and you don't have any idea what's going on. It's a little bit, what's the word? She's made to look maybe a bit younger than she actually is, and so you don't know if this is a sexual assault. You don't know really anything about the context of what's happening. You're just thrown into it. That is the first kind of off-putting thing. And for audiences back then, this would have been their first experience with Cronenberg. And so, right from the get-go, you get this. If you've seen some of his movies, maybe it's not as shocking, but to have that intercut with the banal opening of the movie is what sets off the tone for the rest of the film.
When I first saw it, I was thinking, is this role play, sex play thing going on? Is this an assault? When he starts choking her, I'm like, okay, is this where we're going with this movie? To me, the Hobbs character, who's named after a philosopher, of course, he looked a lot like Freud to me. So when he started breaking in the door, I was just like, am I supposed to think he looks like Freud kind of breaking into this door, or am I just reading way too much into it?
Oh, I think that with Cronenberg, the Freud and Jung stuff comes up so frequently that I have a feeling that that's probably right on the mark. And salacious was the term I was looking for. Like, where is this going? Is this a salacious scene? Is it a transgressive scene? Is it, like you say, role play or sex play? Are they both willing participants? And then it goes into this where he's cutting her open. It turns into psychic surgery. That I remember thinking when I don't know if it was probably at the time I saw this, I was into Andy Kaufman and knew about psychic surgery from him because he had explored that as a cure for his cancer. But I always remember that coming up. What is he doing? What is this all about? And it lends to that feeling of unease, not knowing what he's doing, not seeing any creatures at that point.
I like the smoke effect that they have there. It kind of reminds me of like a witch over cauldron or something, the way that she's bubbling up with stuff. And yeah, you're just completely put out of place as far as what is happening here. Why is he cutting this poor girl open? Why is there smoke coming out of her? What is this madman's purpose?
And then the intercutting kind of continues, and it does throughout the film, which is one of the things I really like about the movie. And we get introduced to the tutors, who are, I guess, one half of our main protagonists of the film. We have Janine and Nick Tudor, and then we'll be introduced shortly to Dr. St. Luke and Nurse Forsyth, who kind of carry us through to the end of the film. But the tutors, this is another thing that confused me while watching Cronenberg movies over the years. The guy that plays Nick Tudor, I always thought was the same guy that plays the main protagonist in Scanners. They have a very similar look. And
I'm glad you said that about the Nicholas Tudor character, because I really did think it was the same actor from Scanners for a long time, and I had to look it up to make sure that they were two different people.
Yeah, they had the same curly hair, same light blue eyes. And I think for years, I just always assumed it was the same guy. And it kind of made sense, at that time, kind of realizing that a lot of directors use the same actors over and over again. Which brings up, of course, Joe Silver as Rollo Linsky in this. And then he is also in Rabbit, and I think those may be the only two films he's in, but I just love it so much when he's on the screen in this one and in Rabbit. And I know when I saw those two films that I recognized him, but I really can't say what from. I know he was a character actor and was in tons of TV and movies through the years, but he was one of the few familiar faces for me when I saw those early Cronenbergs.
If I recognized him from anything, it was probably Death Trap, just because I saw that one so many times when I was younger.
I saw that in the theater, I think, because of Christopher Reeve and being a fan of Superman and going, wow, this is something totally different.
Totally different, yes. Yeah, when he plants one on Michael Caine, it's just like, oh, okay, this isn't the movie I expected.
Yeah.
When I was 10 years old, seeing it like you in the theater. I'm glad you pointed out this whole parody between the tutors and then the doctor and the nurse, just that we have these two couples kind of on either side of things. And even with Mrs. Tudor, then we have the introduction of Betts, which is like another coupling that we have going on there. So we have constantly in this film two people and two people interacting. We saw that with Emil and the woman that he cut up, Annabelle. And then we see this with the doctor and the Joel Silver character, Rollo Linsky. I love that name. They almost always are sets of two that we have through this film.
Well, and I like how that goes towards the economy of the film. And one of the things that I did get out of the new commentary on the Blu-ray was just how limited Cronenberg was in the filming of this, with a 15 days, so basically 2 weeks. And I was really conscious this time, thinking, boy, this really moves at a nice clip, and we're constantly seeing something new. I know who all these people are because of how they get introduced throughout the film. So it's a real efficient, kind of nice, economical, not even 90-minute film with lots of great stuff going on.
Yeah, I kept thinking of the movie that we talked about recently, The Antenna, and just how we weren't aware of who all these players were in that film, and that we were getting protagonists mixed up. Whereas with this one, there is enough differentiation, and we do have enough stories going on that we can tell who these folks are, even when it comes to players that maybe don't even have dialogue, as far as the woman who is doing laundry. And then we see her again later. She looks very different, but we know it's her. And the guy who's doing the room service. And it's also nice, too, because we know that things pass from person to person to person. So at that point in the movie, so we get to see how things are moving through the apartment complex by these kind of tertiary and quaternary characters.
That's one of the things that really works for me with this. It's almost like a passing on of the characters before they're even infected. Again, back to that opening scene when that couple first shows up. We see the security guard. We see Merrick, the, I guess, concierge of the building. And we'll be reintroduced to them throughout the film, and they will interact. And I think the old couple, the gal with the cane and her husband, are led into the building at that point and go up to their apartment. We see the branching off that naturally happens kind of in an apartment complex. You're going to run into these people throughout your day. Then we start to see when they interact with each other once they're infected, or are they infected? And
it's really smart having that opening commercial slideshow kind of thing. It grounds us in time. It grounds us in space. It tells us where we're at. It shows us what the world is like. And it also does the duty of saying you're in an apartment complex that has dentistry, doctors, delicatessen, all of these things. So it sets that world up, and we don't have to ever see those things. We don't have to get the shot of the outside of the doctor's office or whatever. We just know, okay, this guy is the doctor. He must be working in the building because we know that this building has everything. So it's really a very smart way to introduce us to the idea of this one world inside of this apartment complex.
Which is where the comparisons, I guess, to High Rise play into all this. And we can talk about that ever so briefly, since there isn't much to compare other than both that book and the film came out the same year. But it's just so much more interesting for me to follow these poor people who are getting infected by sex bugs than these well-to-do people breaking down because their trash chutes get blocked up. Because they're in control, they're not being infected by sex parasites, and so the only real reason for their behavior is themselves.
If memory serves, High Rise also was supposed to serve as sort of a discussion of class, right? Wasn't it the people on the lower floors are lower class and the people in the penthouse area are upper class? It's almost like the train from Snowpiercer has been stood up on end. So you've got the tailies and then versus the people up top who are the ones in the front car.
Yeah.
And that's something I don't remember the movie discussing that much, was the class difference, because I want to say it stuck more with the, like you were saying, the rich people, the higher ups than we talked about, than the lower tiers of it. It's an interesting idea. I just don't think that the movie did it justice. And it's interesting that you can see the same idea of these insular buildings where you have everything all together in other horror films, things like, if you want to call Gremlins 2 a horror film, or Poltergeist 3, where we're setting everything in the apartment building, in the complex that has everything. It's got your living quarters. It's got every amenity imaginable to man. I mean, that's one of the things I found the most interesting about Poltergeist 3 was it all takes place in the one building.
And that's the one difference that I enjoy between High Rise and Shivers, or the one difference that I really noticed. That in Shivers, the ultimate goal is for them to leave the building and spread the infection as far as they possibly can. And in high rise, they just want to stay where they are. They have no interest in leaving, even though they're running out of food and are eating dog food and or dogs and have no working plumbing or heating or cooling or anything else. They just want to stay there. So that's kind of an interesting difference there, that the end of Shivers is, as Cronenberg, I think, says, it's a happy ending for the virus itself, not necessarily for the people, but they seem pretty happy too.
Yeah, and I love this whole idea of the Starliner and how we're referring to things in these nautical terms, and that the Starliner apartment complex itself is on an island. And it's just like, if you can't get more insular by being on an island, and then you're inside of the apartment complex where it has every amenity, where you really shouldn't ever leave. And it's basically like, it's like a resort, you know, we have everything here. Why would you ever want to go outside? Why would you ever want to leave this place or the island? Why would you ever want to even go into Montreal?
For me, that sounds heavenly, but being stacked on top of other people does not. So it's sort of but you're at the whim of other people a lot of times. And I think that's kind of what high rise also does a little bit better is, yeah, it can get really annoying to be around other people when their music is really loud and there's really not a whole heck of a lot you can do about it.
Not every building comes with a Schneider.
Have no fear, the Schneid is here.
Well, and you got to watch out for this building's maintenance man, that's for sure.
One of, if not the only black man in this entire film. I felt so bad for him. There he's living down in the basement and gets attacked by the doctor. Well, I know that he attacked him first, but still, it was just felt really like, okay, this is what you're going to do to your only black character. All right.
Well, and it brings up the whole point, of course, of this creature. Hobbes wants it to be part aphrodisiac, part venereal disease. People are too uptight.
Hobbes believed that man is an animal that thinks too much, an over-rational animal that's lost touch with its body and its instincts. How do you like that?
Too much brain, not enough guts, and we have a myriad of sexual proclivities, maybe proclivities is a better word, or predilections than perversions, and that run the gamut of lesbianism, homosexuality, pedophilia. For being honest, there are nods to that throughout the film. One of the things that I thought that maintenance man kind of represented was St. Luke's gay panic. He bashes his brains in, but when he's confronted later by Nurse Forsyth, all he does is punch her out. He's sort of an ineffectual hero throughout the film. Really, the only time he goes all out is when he's confronted by the much larger black man.
Paul Hampton leaves a little to be desired as a leading man to me. He just doesn't ever feel like he's as present as some of the other characters. I mean, I tend to like Alan Coleman as Nicholas Tudor a little bit more, and I handle him being on screen more than I do Roger St. Luke. I don't know what it is, but the movie definitely sets us up with actors of varying quality.
It seems like that's a running thing through Cronenberg's first 3 or 4 movies, that male lead is always kind of a blank. I happened to watch Rabid today. Marilyn Chambers' boyfriend in that is pretty blank. You could say the same thing about Art Hindle in The Brood. And I would say Scanners kind of falls into that as well, where it seems like that male lead, there's just something that's not very dynamic about them.
Right. You remember Michael Ironside in that movie, but you don't necessarily remember the main character.
That's why I was kind of wondering when I was watching, especially the scenes between St. Luke and Forsyth. She's taking all her clothes off and he's just kind of sitting there smoking a cigarette.
Right.
Talking to Rollo Linsky on the phone and seems completely unimpressed. Maybe that reads into the gay panic thing. I don't know. I could be reading way more into that. He does encounter another gay couple in the hallway. He just hides from them. He doesn't attack them or anything. But Is this Cronenberg's thing? Is it just we're going to show all these different sexual predilections and he has to react to them? Or is it his character? Is he not interested in Forsyth because maybe he's not interested in women. I don't know. That might be a stretch.
I mean, the Barbara Steele character, Betts, she definitely feels like she is the woman in waiting and just going to prey upon Mrs. Tudor. It's like, when is she going to be vulnerable enough for me to have my way with her?
And I really got that the last couple of times I watched it, because I thought, well, again, is this the effect of the parasite on these people, or is it just amplifying what is already there? And I think that's brought up multiple times in the Shivers book by Luke Aspell. Is this just what they would have done without societal restrictions in the first place? Or is it digging into things that these people really didn't even were aware of consciously? And that's the other kind of great thing about the film being first-time film, low budget, maybe not all that deeply written. You can start reading all of these different things into it because so much of it is left to your own imagination. We don't get why or how these creatures were created. What they actually do to people is ambiguous.
I was really reminded a lot this time watching it of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, as well as the other one that Donald Sutherland was in, which wasn't Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where it was based on a Heinlein story, and it was these creatures that come and attach themselves to the base of your neck. And it's much more like this insidious takeover type plot as opposed to we're going to fuck everybody in the world kind of a plot. But it's very similar as far as these things have control, and they don't necessarily enter your body, but they are in it enough that it can control you. The Puppet Masters, that's what it was called. I was also really reminded, probably because of the way that the creatures looked, I was reminded a lot of the only indigenous life forms on Ceti Alpha 5 from Star Trek II. They look very similar. They're kind of like earwig kind of things, and same color, same type of body, and then as little babies they go inside of your ear, and then as they grow they wrap around the nerves cluster, leaving you in great pain as well as susceptible to suggestions.
There's another film, and I can't think of it, that has a creature that attaches itself to the base of your spine, and I wish I could remember what it is. Or maybe it was an episode of The X-Files.
That could be. I mean, this also sounds very much like The Tingler.
Oh, maybe that's what I'm thinking of. Yes.
It could be.
And I think that was probably mentioned in Bissett's book. I couldn't keep track of all the references to the Cronenberg films, but it was all very interesting. But that question of the infection and how it affects people, on the Antenna episode, I've implied that it's a little bit messy and inconsistent, but listening to the commentary on the new Blu-ray, it's Cronenberg with another fellow, and his thought was that, like other diseases, it kind of ramps up as it goes from body to body. So it's getting more powerful as it transmits. So by the time we get to, say, the delivery boy or the mom and daughter who he attacks, they're ready to go right after that. It seems like some of them have held off for a while. The old man that Dr. St. Luke sees in the clinic, he obviously is already infected. Nick Tudor is obviously already infected. Nick is actively participating with them while they move around in his stomach. Why aren't they ravenous sex fiends? How do the creatures multiply? Are they multiplying within the body? Because Annabelle is the only one that Hobbs infected, but there are at least 4 or 5 that come out of Nick Tudor's stomach.
Which is funny that he infected her, but then I think it's because she sleeps around with people that now we have an outbreak in the building. It's kind of this let's blame the woman thing, even though the man is really to blame because he's the one that came up with the idea.
Yet he does also take his own life, realizing he's most likely infected too. I don't know if he infected himself and her. That's never mentioned. But because of his relationship, his questionable relationship with her, he's most likely infected as well. Although I don't know that slitting one's own throat would necessarily have any effect on these creatures.
Seems like you would want to, again, maybe burn them out with acid or whatever he's doing to her that we don't necessarily see all the effects of.
And beside the little promo video at the beginning that offers exposition as far as the apartment complex itself, the only other real exposition is from Linsky. To me, that's just the best way to get exposition, is to have this guy explain what he thought Hobbs was doing initially, and then what he finds out Hobbs was really doing when he gets his papers from the school after Hobbs has killed himself.
So what he came up with to help our guts along was a parasite that's, a combination of aphrodisiac and venereal disease that will hopefully turn the world into one beautiful, mindless orgy.
And that kind of comes up in the interview with Luke about, even though we have injections of science fiction in a lot of Cronenberg's movies, we don't get the how, whys, and wheres, so they still really lean more towards horror film. Although I don't know that any of this is really all that quote-unquote scary, but I think that unnerving aspect of the film is what, for me at least, keeps it in that horror realm.
Yeah, I have to say the most unnerving part of the film, you mentioned the homosexuality, the lesbianism, the pederasty, all of these things. It fits into the age play stuff. It also fits into possibly bestiality. It's when those two little girls come into the stairwell that are being held on leashes, and you never see the person that's holding them. That, to me, is probably one of the most disturbing images in this film, and it's so brief. But that definitely, if it wasn't a horror film before that moment, it definitely is at that point.
That's brilliant, not showing who has them. Is it another kid? Is it an adult? What is the deal? I mean, it's not overtly sexual, but, since we know that's kind of what these creatures are supposed to be amplifying, it gets that perverse tone that so much of Cronenberg's work has, and he doesn't show really a whole lot of anything. Again, your mind is left to wander, and I think that can be a good thing and a bad thing for a lot of people, and it also sets Cronenberg up for a lot of criticism, where we're putting our own biases and our own prudishness into what we're seeing on the film. And that's where I think that wink, wink, nudge, nudge stuff comes in. Well, I'm not really showing you anything, but, hey, kids on leashes, what do you think that means? Even with the girl and the mom, it's the girl who gives the security guard the fatal kiss, and it's held for a pretty fair amount of time with that step print slow-mo. It's not, I don't think it's illicit or disturbing really in a sexual way, but it's like that pushes it just right to that edge there, where this obviously underage girl is planning this kiss on this older man.
That so reminded me of the little girl in Night of the Living Dead who murders her own mother with the trowel. For whatever reason, just that shot of the little girl leaning over the man so reminded me of that shot. And I think that was probably an intentional thing. And then, that, what did you call the slow-mo, the weird slow-mo?
Step print. I got that term from the Aspell book, which I was glad, because I never knew what that was called. I knew it was not quote-unquote real slow-mo, and I've always really hated it in films. But it's prevalent throughout a lot of Cronenberg's early films. So I think part of it, again, was economical reasons. It's cheaper to do that than to do actual slow motion. But a lot of times I think it was part of his technique early on as well.
If you're going to do slow motion, you have to know that you're going to do slow motion the day that you're shooting it.
Right.
Whereas with this step print stuff, you could decide anything could be that weird form of slow motion. And it is very stylistic. I'm not a fan of it either, but it is. It definitely has a style of its own. It definitely calls a lot of attention to itself.
That became apparent when I watched Stereo and Crimes of the Future. I was like, oh yeah, he's using it here, and it's effective in a way, especially in those, since those are so visual. That's almost all stereo is visuals. It bothers me less in Cronenberg films than elsewhere. And in Shivers, it was used a couple of times just because the action was too fast. And notably when Janine finally goes to Betts' apartment and she does that turn that's also in step print slow-mo. And on the commentary, he's like, yeah, she just turned too fast. It needed to have more heft to it. Like, this is going to happen now.
Yeah, I was glad the Aspell book definitely pointed out a few things that I was not necessarily aware of before, some of the technical aspects and some of the things to do with the script. I was very glad to hear, I talked about Freud earlier. I was glad that there was actually a name drop of Freud that you can read in the script, and that it seems like it was recorded on the soundstage, but then was changed later on via, ADR, where it was Lynn Lowry talking about the dream that she has, and rather than it being an old man, it's actually Freud that is the old man in her dream. So I was glad that they changed that. It would have been a little too heavy-handed, but I was glad that Aspell was able to point that out in his book.
The quotes in Linsky's office, or I guess Linsky and Hobbs' office, kind of sums up Cronenberg's early work. The road to excess leads to the palace of wisdom, and that's from William Blake. And then, of course, Hobbes has his own quote, which fits into this and Rabbit. Sex is the invention of a clever venereal disease. All the parasite wants to do is procreate, and it procreates by infecting other people, and this makes perfect sense to have the transmission be either a kiss or, for a few people, being straight out attacked by them. And that's where it kind of loses me a little bit, the flying parasites with the laundry woman and poor Rollo Linsky. But it leads to that question that comes up in just about every interview with Cronenberg about the film, and how a lot of what's in Shivers was borrowed for Alien. And I think that the similarities are pretty superficial, but it's kind of an interesting thing to look at. Leaping on the face, bursting out of the body, being passed on from person to person. And that's kind of, to me, where the similarities end there.
The idea of the aliens being more of a sexual thing, I think, comes through in some of the more in even the H.R. Giger prototypes, having the way that the tail looks is much more phallic. So and even somewhat the head, you could also describe that as. I mean, I've read a lot of stuff about Alien, especially Alien 3, and even Aliens, especially about motherhood and these kind of things. It's an interesting stepping stone to go from Shivers to Alien to something like The Thing, which is going to also talk about the way that you pass things from one person to another. And each time we make this progression, we're getting closer and closer to the AIDS epidemic, to the point where the early 80s we were in the heat of the AIDS epidemic. And I know, Carpenter and other people have said, no, The Thing isn't about AIDS, but it's right in that time. And you can just see oh yeah, not only is this venereal disease from Shivers, super dangerous, but, now it's kind of coming to the real world where this kissing and passing of things from one person to another is deadly. Yeah, sure, we had deadly venereal diseases before, but my God, AIDS was the killer disease for a while.
And me not seeing most of these until the mid-'80s or later, there was no way around seeing that kind of stuff. And yet it's not, the infection in this isn't necessarily deadly. Tudor, they emerge from his stomach, but when he gets up later, it looks like maybe there's just a small hole in his stomach, and is killed by St. Luke, so he wasn't killed by the parasites. Linsky is killed by Tudor. He wasn't killed by the parasites. The maintenance man is killed by St. Luke. I guess we don't really know yet what the outcome is for the people that are infected, other than ramping up their sexual appetite.
Yeah, I expected at one point in the movie that someone would fall over and their whole body would just burst open with these things, like E.G. Marshall in Creepshow with all the cockroaches coming out of him or something. But I was glad that they didn't go there. And it isn't very interesting that you're right, that this is much more in tune with our bodies, and it's not trying to necessarily kill us, that it has to keep the host alive in order to procreate.
You describing somebody splitting open with these things just made me automatically think of Videodrome and the cancer is it Oblivion that falls on the ground and splits open with all the cancer tumors coming out of him?
Well, even when Tudor is scratching his stomach, I kept thinking of Max Wren with that vagina stomach. Like, oh, that'd be a perfect place to store your VHS tapes.
Let's go ahead and take a break and play an interview with Luke Aspell, the author of the Shivers monograph from Auteur Publishing. And I want to apologize in advance for the apparently spotty connection that I had with Luke. So there is some digital detritus in that. But have a listen, and we'll be back right after.
Why not breed a parasite that can do something useful? Huh? A parasite that can take over the function of a human organ.
What was your first experience with Shivers?
I think I first saw Shivers at some point between January and June of 2007 on DVD in a friend's room in the halls of residence at university. I was drunk, actually, and half asleep, and I'm not sure I stayed for all of it. When I watched it again, I wasn't certain I'd even seen it all the first time. But then when I saw Barbara Steele's first scene, I thought, oh, yes, I remember. And then when I saw Alan Majakowski vomiting onto the umbrella, I thought, yes, I remember this. It all came back then.
And were you familiar with Cronenberg's work at that point?
Yes, I was familiar with... I'd seen everything from Rabid to Eastern Promises, if it had already come out at that point. I'm not sure if it had come out yet, but I'd seen everything up to that point, except for Fast Company and M. Butterfly, neither of which are by any means unimportant. I think that they're both quite important. I think Fast Company is more revealing than major, of course, but M. Butterfly is pretty major, I'd say. Yeah. So apart from those two, I'd seen everything. I hadn't seen Stereo and Crimes of the Future yet, and I hadn't seen the first shorts.
Since you had seen so much, where did Shivers kind of fit in for you in his oeuvre?
My initial impression of it was of a really rough object with unplaceable sense of humor that really doesn't come up again in the same way. I really associated his films, I still do, with a kind of sorrow. I think more than being horrifying, Cronenberg's films, including his horror films, are sad, leading up to The Fly, But there's this sense of tragedy and mortality, like there are kinds of horror film where people get killed quite lightly. It has a weight around it, but the weight is fairly generic. But with him, mortality always feels tragic. But Shivers had this sense of humor that was quite unexpected and also quite funny when you encounter it drunk. It's funny anyway, in a horrible way. But it had a sort of attitude that was quite different from the later films. But then it sort of passed out of my mind. I mean, it wasn't an ideal viewing. And so I really got to know it when I came to write about it. And one of the reasons I wanted to write about Shivers was that I didn't know it that well. That was one of the things it had going for it, that my impressions of it were going to be quite fresh. But at that time, I would have said, as I think a lot of people do, that it's different. It's the beginning. I wouldn't say now that it's prototypical. I might have been more inclined to say something like that at the time, though I hope I would have been suspicious of saying anything so, sort of reductive. I think hybridity is underrated. And now I would say definitely, having seen Stereo and Crimes of the Future, it's transitional. One of the points I make in the book is that Cronenberg didn't come from horror and desert it, which some horror fans, that's the construction that they kind of put on his career. He passed through it, having a sort of sensibility that suited it. He entered horror, moved through it, and passed out. And if you look at them together, it makes sense the maker of Crimes of the Future would eventually make Naked Lunch. There is a continuity of which the horror period is part. And arguably you could say he'd returned to horror, although people didn't seem to notice it. But you could argue that he returned to horror up to a point with Maps to the Stars.
You mentioned the humor in Shivers, and I noted in your book the notion that it was a satire. Is some of that humor so purely Canadian that it might get lost on other viewers?
I wouldn't say so, but Shivers has flashes of social satire. I don't think it's a consistent satire. And I think the targets are quite broad. North American, Anglospheric, or even just Western. I nearly said universal, but they aren't, of course. The gestures of satire are, I think, a generational thing, a way of rationalizing ugly or forbidden emotions. I'm not nasty, I'm not a misanthrope, I'm satirizing the bourgeoisie. I mean, I don't find Cronenberg's satire of the lifestyle as such that convincing, partly because when he ended up making a more autobiographical film, The Brood, a little bit later, the milieu of that is completely bourgeois. It's as bourgeois as a Claude Chabrol film. As a joke once, to define his sensibility as an alternative to Cronenbergian, he came up with Cronenbourgeois. Yeah, I mean, there is that element, which, of course, is what rubs some people up the wrong way, among other things. And I think also the generational thing, I mean, I think a big thing is the fact that he had been in this sort of cultural moment, like all filmmakers of his generation, where you didn't trust anyone over 30, and now he's over 30. And it's that thing of how do you accommodate, if you want to be, for example, a professional filmmaker, not an underground filmmaker, how do you adjust? And one of the biggest gaps, actually, I think in our understanding of Cronenberg, potentially, one of the biggest gaps is the films he made as a self-shooter, like in the early 70s for Canadian television. I think he made them sort of semi-speculatively and then approached them and they showed them. I'm not quite sure. But he made these sort of short films like Jim Ritchie's Sculptor, which are these very short, sort of some of them quite poetic, filmed about like artistic process or landscape or buildings or whatever. And I think because he shot them himself and directed them and they're not narrative, those might be very interesting. I think the biggest sort of clue in his sort of available work to what those might be like would be Secret Weapons. The beginning of Secret Weapons is this quite beautiful tracking shot, if I remember rightly, through a forest. But we see light through trees in a forest, and there's this air where you think, well, it would be quite nice to spend some time here without narrative for a little bit. But then this kind of thriller plot starts, which is quite fun. It's a bit like Robert Kramer, but with a thriller plot. Kramer made a film called Ice. They're sort of thrillers, but all the cast are hippies. Well, what it is, it's like, so Ice is this thing which is like, it's technically a science fiction film in a sense that it is set in the future, but it's set in a future very easily extrapolated from the mood in America in about 1968, 1969, of hippies at war with the government and having a kind of street war, wondering about their own ability to be in that war and like their capacity to for violent revolution and their training and are they up to it. Secret Weapons is like a kind of a tongue-in-cheek, slightly genre version of that. It's a bit like Scanners in that it feels very found location oriented and it feels like it was made up as they went along. But it's got this investigator character and it's got that kind of student film thing where this fellow is playing a kind of worldly wise investigator and he's like obviously this sort of hippie mate of Cronenberg's who has disguised himself as an older man by putting on a fedora. He's an art type who's wearing a hat, so now he's a straight adult. That is the transition. You put a hat on. You put a hat on and you're a private eye. You're Humphrey Bogart.
You mentioned that Cronenberg passed through horror, and I'm just curious how Cronenberg eschews the modern horror tropes.
The overwhelming thing is the materialism, the focus on the body, just as his approach to filmmaking is materialist. So he started writing screenplays to direct himself at a point where he already knew how to shoot, how to edit. He'd used an optical printer. He knew all these hands-on tasks that you learn making experimental films. That also is part of his approach to fear. or to, what frightens him, the way in which he takes off from that imaginatively. Having said that, I think in Shivers you have a really interesting hybridity, and in general I would say he's a materialist artist of the irrational. So he needs, as I put it, a solid empiricist runway for his flights of fancy. But the how is never that clear. And in Shivers, the manufacture of the parasites, how do you breed a creature like that? How do you manufacture it, an organic thing like that? What is it based on? What material is it based on? How is it engineered? All of those things that would get at least some sort of technobabble in a science fiction film aren't there. What's there is repulsion, the shape and size of the parasites, the texture of them, what people look like when they've been infected, how they behave. Most of the fear is created by people's behavior and the subversion of people's reason by this material, of course, the subversion of their identity by something that's happening to the body. It's interesting that it's the only one of those horror films, really, where you could say that it's not really a cancer metaphor or a metaphoric cancer, because it is explicitly introduced to the body. There is, they're mistaken for growths at first, but they aren't something the body is doing or something that's done to the body and starts to happen within the body. The body's reaction to some external stimulus. They are actually these physically introduced, separate, autonomous creatures. They're an infection. I'm sort of drifting from your question, but basically I'd say that vampirism, curses, haunted houses, and so forth, they access the same energy of irrationality and fear and the surreal. I mean, I think that you can cover him with fantastique, the French genre that takes in Eraserhead, Jean Rollin, everything else, like everything from a surrealist film to practically space opera is covered all in this thing of fantastique. And I think, or fantastique, I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly, but Cronenberg eschews the supernatural cues for that kind of irrational emotion, but he doesn't transcend the emotion. He is horror rather than science fiction, and therefore irrational emotions, irrational states, irrational perceptions are ultimately what he's going for. But he has to get to them through a sense of physical, tangible, empirical reality. I'd say with Shivers, he isn't as tough from them as he is in subsequent films, chiefly because of the presence of Barbara Steele, iconographically, her associations, and then her use of the climax. And I get into this in the book. I think that the fact that wasn't his original plan, her presence at the climax, but not as the chief figure involved. There's a sense of a passing on of occult heft, of energy, because she's present, but then the actual transmission of the parasite in a very romantic, emotionally logical way is given to Forsyth. That is emotionally very satisfying and gives us a happy ending, a conventional happy ending. The implication, particularly the Jungian resonances of the three women in the pool at the end, indicate an interest in both ways of thinking. The fact that he's a very moderate filmmaker in a way, or at least he is sort of hybrid himself. He has both that ability to access imaginative and irrational ideas, surreal ideas, and a sense of their material, rational context. Again, that control, which is manifested in his classical style as well. He never uses a zoom. He has a sense of composition and of organizing people in the frame in relation to each other. Blocking and mise-en-scène in his films is always, you can relate it to a classical tradition. It's flexible, but it is, in many respects, very classical for a filmmaker of his generation. It relates to that interestingly. There's that sense of having one foot in the irrational, but also having a sense of control and discipline, which later enabled him to transfer into a kind of filmmaking that is sort of both horror and not horror, like Dead Ringers and Crash. They aren't horror films, but you can see how, again, that there is a continuity.
Can the argument be made that these first 3 or 4 films, or up to Videodrome, are more akin to science fiction than horror?
I wouldn't say so, because in science fiction, the methodology counts. How it's done is never actually of that much interest to Cronenberg. For example, in The Brood, we never learn how that therapy works, How does that happen? Why does that happen? How does one thing lead to the other? We don't get any clear idea of how the grafting procedure has led to what happens in Rabid. The SF elements are textural, and they come from the fact that it's a materialist vision. So there has to be a sense of how it was done in terms of cause and effect. But the way cause leads to effect is very vague. I mean, it is poetic and surreal rather finally than technological, rather than being an extrapolation from science or inspired by science. Now, obviously, I mean, some science fiction is a lot more like science fantasy than other science fiction, but he is more, his vagueness about it, it's more like with J.G. Ballard, you have this where, you know, he has scientific education, but then he'll say things about the relationship between the shape of someone's wound and the angle between two walls, and you really are into surrealist poetry. You aren't at all into anything scientific, even though each stage of the image or each stage of the paragraph in like Atrocity Exhibition, each stage, each link in what he's saying is very physical, but it amounts to something that's emotionally rational, surreal, and really completely illogical. Whereas with science fiction, the promise is always that cause and effect got us into this, cause and effect can get us out. Or sometimes not, depending on what period you're looking at. I, of course, think things did get very downbeat in the 70s. I mean, like you have, the only one I can think of is the Stepford Wives, but you have quite a few kind of downbeat things there. The one possibly SF Cronenberg is Scanners. But even there, you have the outrageous revelation that computers can be scanned, just like people. And how does that work? This sort of mingling organic and technological. That is, it becomes really almost about psychic, really it does become about psychic phenomena, and then you are into the intangible and the metaphysical. And of course it concludes with a very metaphysical ending where consciousness is divorced from flesh. Consciousness of one person ends up being in a different body. And so it's interesting that having made something that was a lot more technological than his other films and a lot less organic, there's a lot of rushing about and cars crashing in Scanners, or there is in my memory of it. Having made something that was very technological and also derived from a real life and quite famous scientific issue, which was thalidomide, really, I think is the inspiration for what's going on there. Something going on the market, and it turns out it has quite severe, unforeseen side effects on the fetus. It's as though, having been very technological and science fictional in that film more than usual, he sort of rewarded himself with a bit of like pure ghostliness at the end.
So we use the term body horror to describe Cronenberg's early work these days. I think that the term venereal horror might be more apt, at least for the first two.
Yes. When a term becomes fixed enough that people can just throw it into an article and it's like a keyword almost. It sort of replaces thought. I think one of the things about venereal horror as an alternative is it does sort of point up how his work fell into a very interesting period, because there was a period of time when there was no incurable sexually transmitted disease. Everything that you could get sexually was curable. It's that sort of window which ends with the discovery of HIV and AIDS. That's a question as well, the degree to which the fear at that time might have been seen as pleasure-phobic, which of course is something people got into, which I think was really not quite right, although it has to be said some of the arguments that were made against that. Well, I mean, pleasure-phobic was not quite the term used. It was a lot more political, of course. He was accused of things. So venereal horror covers the distance between the most famous appropriation of his ideas very well, Alien, which is pretty obviously, I mean, some people think it was sort of a coincidence. I don't really think it was. I think if you put together Jodorowsky's Dune and those designs and concepts from Shivers, that there isn't that much left to invent to come up with Alien. Of course, the point about Alien is that it completely misses the point of venereal horror. It misses the point of body horror, which is that the body is not serving you. It's been taken over. It's your existence is being subverted. The material ground of your being is being subverted, because it's like revealing whodunit, in the middle of in midstream or in the first 20 minutes, or like saying who killed Laura Palmer. As soon as it bursts out of his chest, right, well, there's no more mystery. It's just a question of avoiding the critter and catching the critter. So it sort of uses it, and people have written reams about all the profound stuff that they find in Alien. And of course, nothing against that. But the idea of walking around as a sort of horny, bloodied zombie, like Nick Tudor at the end of Shivers, is far more horrifying than this agonizing, spectacular, but relatively quick death. Because it's the idea of not being yourself, of not serving your own interests.
Is sex really as entangled in Cronenberg's work as fans and critics have made it out to be?
I hope so. It's certainly something that we all seem to perceive there. It is. This goes back to the materialism, sex and death. These are the things that he's looking at. As to the question of whether we're supposed to be repulsed by the invasion of our bodies and liberation of our desire, if that's what's happening, I think both. Certainly in this film, it's that question again of the ground of identity. And if identity is subverted, it's interesting how often people classify Shivers as a variant of the zombie film, because zombies never tend to be after, at least they didn't at that time. Things gradually were, of course, more and more developed by George A. Romero and other people. They don't tend to be after what they were after in life. Whereas from a sort of orthodox Freudian point of view, they are in Shivers. And so, and the variety of the perversions we see, and they are sort of conceived as that, I think, the variety of the expressions of the presence of the parasite we see. No two sufferers of this infection behave in the same way, really. There are some general rules, but they go from comic to menacing, and there are fetishistic people, and there are people who have very specific, what we would call perversions. The question of whether things are moralized or not, I wouldn't say that they aren't. Again, it's a question of rationality and tension of rationality. The concept of the liberation of sexuality that Robin Wood, for example, faulted Cronenberg for standing against, as he saw it. This was a reactionary film against sexual liberation. The problem is that as soon as you apply those ideas of sexual liberation socially, in the way that people did using Reich, and Wilhelm Reich was a conservative. He was very anti-communist, and he always, I think, voted Republican. He wasn't the guru figure he was turned into in the early 70s by the New Left. And I think, again, you get the idea of repressive desublimation, I think is the term, where once the freedom becomes commodified, it immediately becomes part of the oppressive structure. So if you wanted to defend Shivers on Marxist grounds, you could probably defend it that way. I don't think the film is without, not moralizing, but without a moral center, because it assumes that we will be more or less appalled by rape, more or less appalled by abuse. It's very fortunate that it seems as though the Starliner is one of those places that don't allow pets. So things aren't as spectacularly dreadful as they could be. But of course, he manages to get that in by allusion and get paedophilia in at the same time. So I think there is a moral point of view, because really the film was faulted by Robin Wood essentially for not endorsing abuse. The problem is that there was this concept derived from Wilhelm Reich of a social program of liberation. But the problem is it sort of, in retrospect, seems to have dithered or fudged over the question of consent, which to us seems absolutely central. You know, you can't imagine how people could have thought, okay, well, we will revolutionarily prescribe group sex and what Wood euphemistically calls age difference, which I'm going to say on the record I find rather disturbing. But obviously at the time no one minded that he just called age difference. There were a lot of people who thought that it was always a question of what's the next thing people want to do that is forbidden, and we'll say that shouldn't be. There does seem to be a hand-waving of consent that possibly sees consent as analogous to personal property rights, which actually brings us to the Marquis de Sade's Frenchmen some more effort if you wish to become Republicans, in which it's proposed the revolution won't really be achieved until the divine Marquis can rape anyone he likes in the street. And I don't think most revolutionary workers, most radicals would now go along with that idea. I don't think most people would now think that physical autonomy bodily agency and so forth are bourgeois. I think most people would agree that this was people sort of trying to attach a rider that satisfied their own pathologies onto the ideological sort of discussions of the time. And of course, things like that were a gift to the right, because people might think that they are interested in, living in a social democratic society. But then if you hit out with, by the way, there isn't going to be any such thing as the family, people are going to go, wait, what? But the ending isn't non-judgmental. It's jubilant in a consciously world-upending way. I think the thing is, it's a Canadian liberal tolerance thing. So basically, obviously, there are some deviations that are benign. There are some deviations that are comic, like the old man who Cronenberg, I'm pretty sure, is dubbing himself with the beard, who offers his implausibly porny-looking daughter, Erica. But, well, there you are. It's that sort of giggly. There are some perversions that cause giggles, like the idea of this father and daughter thing, which is obviously comic. And of course, I think the reaction shot there in that scene is brilliant.
This brings up the controversy surrounding the film itself and its funding and the Robert Fulford critique that came out. This marked Cronenberg's career for quite a while. What do you think the fallout was from the Fulford critique?
I think it's telling that the only place you can find Fulford's piece is in a promotional booklet produced at the time and available as a PDF on the Cinepix website. Bad reviews, especially ones that condemn on moral grounds, have always been useful to exploitation film promotion. I wonder if Cronenberg knew what would happen. He knew Fulford before he showed him the film. Can he really have had no inkling of how he'd react to such a film? The ideological dividing lines were very sharp at that time between what was legitimate and illegitimate filmmaking. Canada hadn't really done auteurism. I mean, not mainstream, but to be fair, I mean, a lot of mainstream outlets had resisted it at first, but Canada still were. And Fulford obviously has a kind of film society view of what constitutes a legitimate film for a serious filmmaker to be making, a serious Canadian filmmaker to be making. If you're trying to sell a Canadian state product in America, arriving with a reputation of having been too extreme for the system to handle can't have hurt. How do we know who Robert Fulford is? We actually only know who he is as a character in Cronenberg's legend. We had to be told about him to learn about the difficulty he caused him. But internationally, in America and in general, it probably did him a lot of good. And in the long term, it probably did him a lot of good because he could be the misunderstood artist. I don't think there's anything cynical about saying that an artist can be misunderstood and even oppressed and also find it useful to play the misunderstood artist. It's a strategy. If in the economics of the thing, it puts you in a category that up to a point wins you an audience. I mean, there are a lot of people working in the studio system at different times who were helped to be regarded as artistic, and their work came to be saleable in those terms because they had run-ins with the studio and then let everyone know about it. Cinepix were a company who produced sex films that were too softcore and sweet-natured for the American marketplace, who they reasoned might prefer a horror film. It was a plan. And it's like that old punchline, you say that like it's a bad thing. Fulford's criticisms aren't inaccurate as such, if you read the whole piece. He's criticizing real phenomena, but from perspective opposed to what became the new orthodoxy, which includes all of us. I think his critique was more legitimate than that of Robin Wood and his supporters, acolytes. I think Fulford had certainly a historical and cultural reason for disapproving of Shivers, as well as a biographical one, because he knew Cronenberg and thought he could do better, that I think it was on its own terms legitimate. I think almost always these things help in the long run. I think they might dent things in the short term. In the long run, part of reaching the right people is being seen to be disapproved of by the wrong ones.
The motifs with this first film, Shivers, do they continue going all the way up to Map to the Stars?
I would say they do continue. Maps to the Stars had a lot to do with, architecturally, first of all, there are certainly resonances. the body, the material ground of Cronenberg's films, the beginning always from the body, means that in a sense all his films are the same genre. I mean, if you were going to say, is he horror or science fiction, you could quote Tag Gallagher idea. The critic Tag Gallagher has sort of suggested that every filmmaker is a genre to themselves. You can certainly follow through the experimental films to the horror films and out again, the view of the body, the relationship to body, the ways in which the changing, the mutability of the body or of the psyche destabilizes identity. You can follow that to Spider and A History of Violence, through to Cosmopolis, through to Maps to the Stars. Because he starts from that relationship between consciousness and the body, and because he starts from a very materialist worldview that encompasses the architecture of filmmaking and the architecture of architecture and forms, and the way in which he makes the films physically, they're not pre-visualized, they're not storyboarded. He makes them in a sculptural way. The elements have to be together before the compositions, the relations between people in rooms become clear, and the way in which consciousness comes out of the body and returns to it is, for want of a better way of putting it, I think means that he's been able to keep a very consistent and, crucially, a very flexible worldview. And I think for any auteur, I think we always look for consistency, and to an extent we mean by that repetition. Because the way we talk about auteurs and recognize them has to do with whether you can recognize the same eye across decades in which every other technical contribution has been switched out. You have a different cinematographer, you have a different editor, you have a different production designer, the material resources are different. You're looking, say, at sound instead of silence, or color instead of black and white, and yet you can see the same eye and you can perceive the same psyche. The crucial thing that we don't talk about enough, in a way, when talking about auteurs, possibly, is flexibility. Because if you aren't flexible, if you're brittle, you're not going to last, and you are going to have to withdraw, because things change around you. The flexibility, the adaptability is the thing that has made Cronenberg able to sort of remain himself, and sometimes making films that seemed like departures. Like Eastern Promises really seemed like an aberration when he made it, and it still sort of stands out to a degree. It is a step further along a path from A History of Violence. But, I mean, A History of Violence seemed anomalous when it came out. The consistency in Cronenberg is partly thanks to the flexibility and the fact that his personality is so much to do with the sculptural aspects of filmmaking and the process. Because his personality is so responsive and dialectical, he isn't laconic. He isn't someone who states something and that's it. I mean, the person I immediately think of in comparison with Cronenberg as an example of what he isn't would be John Carpenter, who's laconic, who has a certain style, who has such a definite view of things that when he changes it even slightly, he seems to be diluting. He seems to be being diluted into something more ordinary. That consistency and that sort of laconic existential quality, that unchangeable, geometric unchangeability, so that when you look at the thing in context, it seems anomalous because the shape of the thing is so irregular and organic. You know, when you see an irregular shape in a John Carpenter frame, it has a punctuating quality. It has something, and I think graphic aspects as well. That's something which is interesting to consider. The fact that the relationship between, and this now we really are getting into the sort of atrocity exogen J.G. Ballard sort of thing, but in terms of thought association or trains of thought or streams of consciousness, but maybe there is a relationship between Cronenberg's fascination with physically irregular shapes and his flexibility as a filmmaker that enabled him to remain himself through so many different production circumstances. Say John Carpenter's relative geometric continence. There may even be a relationship, because if you have a very particular style, it can so easily become a manner or a manneristic thing. And the fewer things you are willing to let into yourself, the more you are at risk of a sort of impression of dilution, because you're defined by this sort of absolute stylistic continence, defined by this sort of unchanging quality. And if that is the part of the job of being a film auteur that resonates with your personality, then you may be in trouble quite quickly, relatively speaking. Whereas Cronenberg was always adapting, in a sense. The fact that his way into filmmaking is to go, put it, from the cathedral to the garage. He was making these respectable and actually quite classical for underground movies. By stereo, he had already eliminated zooms at a time when people were picking up the zoom and loving it. That wasn't going to be how he saw things. And I think the fact that he mastered filmmaking physically meant that, in a way, because he had already changed greatly once, he could change again. And at the same time, he does remain himself, because his concerns do have a sort of universal resonance within the human condition. So to an extent, it's quite easy to get wherever there's any psychology, wherever there's anything bodily, and that covers a hell of a lot of ground. He can get into what he's doing. So, for example, in Eastern Promises, there's one very erotic shot, which is actually the shot of the back of a motorbike, this motorcycle exhaust. It feels like he's looking at something organic or even something sure. And it's amazing how he can transmit that. Because, of course, he has this, fascination with mechanical things as well, and has wanted for years to make a film about car racing in the context of these very organic, very, genital or whatever, venereal horrors. It seems like a jump. And, of course, part of the reason perhaps he never got to make that was typecast, because typecasting of a director is actually very useful to the industry. And, of course, that's one of the things, it's one of those sort of balances where, on the one hand, they want you to compromise, but the ideal studio product is a compromised film that seems to be completely you. Which again comes into the whole thing of the nature of purity of vision in relation to commercial cinema and what you have to do to get over. In order to be someone who never makes any compromises, you have to first start by making compromises. You don't get to the point of being able to make Crash unless you're willing to go from Stereo and Crimes of the Future to Shivers.
You touched on this a bit, and we talked about this earlier. Why a book on Shivers as opposed to any of the other Cronenberg films that you were familiar with?
Once it had been established between John Atkinson at Auteur and myself that I'd be writing about a Cronenberg film, I settled on three favorites: Shivers, Rabid, and Videodrome. I already knew that I wanted the book to be a close reading, scene by scene, shot by shot where necessary. Rabid seemed to call for a feminist reading at this point in history. I knew the Soska sisters' remake was on the way, so I thought it best to leave the first monograph on the film for a woman to write. Videodrome would need to be disentangled from a lot of quite dated, politically dubious theory from Baudrillard and writers influenced by him. Too big a task for the word count available to me. So Shivers it was, and for two positive reasons as well as those negative ones. Firstly, my fascination with beginnings, about which in the commercial cinema, at least, there's so often something hybrid, impure, not yet fully formed. Secondly, and most importantly, Shivers is the only one of Cronenberg's horror films that unnerves me. It's unnerving in the way that certain novels by William S. Burroughs and J.G. Ballard are unnerving. Like them, it gives you that feeling of, is he allowed to imagine this? Am I allowed to witness it? Am I in trouble for having watched it? The relative neglect of Shivers in the academic and critical literature on Cronenberg suggested to me that this feeling was widely shared. I'd often thought that too little writing on film, even with horror film, was written from a position of ambivalence and unease. People tend to be quite confident of, boosting a film or condemning. So Shivers was my chance to sit with those reactions and analyze how they were elicited, alleviated, amplified, and so on over the course of the film.
Where is the best place to buy the book on Shivers?
You can get it from the website of the Liverpool University Press, Columbia University Press, Wordery, or, if you must, Amazon.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, Luke. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, great to speak to you.
Poor birdie. Why, they're always crashing into tall buildings. The windows fool them,
Oh, come along, Olive.
It's such a shame.
Welcome back. We are talking about David Cronenberg's Shivers. And we've mentioned a couple of the films that this is similar to. But what are some of the other movies that come to mind when we talk about Shivers and Parasites and
Well, we talked about a couple with The Thing and Alien. Another one, I mentioned the Puppet Masters. Another good alien passing from one person to another is The Hidden. Mm-hmm. I can definitely see that. And the hidden creature is definitely a lot larger than the Shivers Parasite, but I can see it kind of being in the same genus.
That also brings up, which I didn't talk about earlier, was how these creatures look in Shivers and how that is part of the unnervingness of the film, because they basically look like turds or phalluses of some sort or intestines. And I like that Linsky says kishkas.
You're bored, right? To you, organ transplant is just yesterday's kishkas, right?
And if you look up kishkas, they are not unlike the parasites in the film. So, and I think kishka is a Yiddish word for guts or intestines.
Yeah, and you get that weird rape of Barbara Steele where it's kind of coming out of the sink or coming out of the drain and going inside of her, and you're just like, oh, this is not good.
That's the more exploitative scene in the film, and probably one of the things that really disturbed me when I was younger and watching it. I don't think too much of it now because there's been so many tub scenes in film since then. I mean, it's basically redone in Slither, and even the Nightmare on Elm Street scene with Freddy's glove coming out of the tub. It's a very vulnerable position for a person, male or female. You brought up also Invasion of the Body Snatchers. We're not changing the people, we're swapping them out. And in The Thing, it's kind of the same idea. Well, maybe not. Is it absorbing them and becoming them, or is it just going inside of them and becoming them? And the whole idea with the ripped clothes kind of makes you think that it's gotten rid of the original. I don't know.
I've always thought that was a way to set up McMurphy, because you see the one guy, the guy who looks a little bit like Frank Oz or Irvin Kershner, who's got the arm that's still not transformed, and the very alien arm. I always feel that it goes inside of your blood and becomes all of you eventually, like replacing every single cell until it becomes you wholly. I don't necessarily see them dumping a body someplace.
I haven't seen this in a long time, but I think it's mentioned in the Bissett book. The Henenlotter film Brain Damage kind of has a similar creature.
Yeah. Kind of reminds me of, what is that called? The Asphyx, which was a older horror film where it's this whole thing of like I think that Henenlotter would truck a lot in, and I could be wrong, kind of like Lovecraft type of stuff. And I think that the Asphyx was based on a Lovecraft story as well.
We also have, of course, the apartment complex scenario, which I hated living in apartments, but for some reason I love movies that take place in apartment buildings. And obviously this is very different than, say, The Tenant or Rosemary's Baby or something like that. But it gives you that same idea of you can't really escape your neighbors when you're living side to side and stacked on top of each other.
I'm trying to remember, I think was it an Indonesian film where it was set mostly in an apartment? The Raid, I think it was. And then The Raid came out right around the same time as Dread, and there were people that were saying, oh, Dread is just a ripoff of this, but I love that Dread has the same, the Peachtrees complex is that same idea of everything being in one building and you never need to leave. And then that movie is somewhat like a video game because you're fighting from level to level to level until you get to the big boss up top kind of thing. That and something like Wreck, the I think it's Spanish film, which was remade as Quarantine. Yeah. That whole thing of we're fighting through this apartment building, I thought was very clever, very well done.
And you brought up, I think, is it Land of the Dead? I get the later Dead films confused.
Land of the Dead is definitely I'm not going to say it's the last good Romero film, but I was not a fan of the last one that he did.
Was that the found footage one?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I couldn't. I didn't get very far in that one.
Who went forward before you got there and set up all these lights? Who is doing all this stuff?
Land of the Dead deals with the class struggle as well, kind of like High Rise. Is that correct? It's been so long since I watched that one. I just watched One Bedroom or One BR. It's on Netflix right now. It's not supernatural or anything like that, but it's an apartment complex and creepy neighbors and possibly a cult. I enjoyed it quite a lot, and it seems like a lot of other people are getting a kick out of it as well.
I forgot all about Survival of the Dead, which was one that he made after Diary of the Dead. That one, I think, had a zombie horse, possibly? I can't remember.
Well, one of the other things that comes up when I think about Shivers, and like I mentioned at the top of the episode, I could never remember which movie it was that had the alternate titles, if it was Rabbit or Shivers. I think most of us have known Shivers as Shivers for a really long time now, but when it was released in the States, it was They Came From Within. And I remember seeing that video cover was this strange ripoff of that famous National Geographic cover with the girl with the really pale green eyes.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't work for the movie because I think that's one of the reasons that I never rented it, besides probably not realizing that it was a David Cronenberg film, but it doesn't really represent the film too well. I like the other titles. The original title on the script was The Orgy of the Blood Parasites, which lends itself to that exploitation aspect. That was the idea to get it into the US market. Like, let's do a Roger Corman thing. That title always kind of makes me laugh. And then The Parasite Murders, which is what they shot under, which is misleading and uninspired. And then Shivers, and I don't get what that is in reference to in regards to the film.
Yeah, that is really questionable. What is it? Are the people shivering? Are the creatures shivering? I mean, it's not like once you get the creature inside of you, you do a big shake or something. It is a really odd choice for a title.
I kind of like They Came From Within because it references the parasites themselves, and then it references our characters at the end of the film. They're coming from within the Starliner Tower to go out into Montreal and beyond to infect the rest of the world, kind of like The Thing. We should have Wilford Brimley doing on his computer figuring out, what the transmission rate will be for the parasites.
They want to be us.
That thing wanted to be us.
Yeah, and the other, not to be gauche, but the double nature of came to represent an orgasm, is another way that you can play upon that. So I kind of prefer that title.
Yeah, I was sort of hoping that the Blu-ray would come with a double-sided sleeve and have that They Came From Within. Not the one with the girl. There was another one that's supposed to be Barbara Steele in the tub.
And I think you're totally right that the James Gunn film really played on Shivers, and because wasn't the poster for that somebody in a tub?
I believe so. I know that there is a tub scene, and I know that it's a direct reference to Shivers. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's more callbacks and stuff to Shivers in that.
Oh, Squirm is the other movie I'm thinking of, which I think also had a little bit of influence on Slither. Just the worms coming out of the face kind of remind me of Greg Henry, what happens to his character in Slither. It's been a while since I've seen it.
There's a movie called Spasms, which I've never seen. I just remember looking at that video cover every time I went into the rental store, and there's something emerging from a man's face. And I don't have any idea what happens in Spasms, but I used to always get Spasms and Squirm conflated because of that.
I remember that box. I remember it was like a screaming woman up top and another photo below of a guy with a really messed up face. And yeah, I've never seen that one either. It was interesting hearing Cronenberg talk about the Jonathan Demme connection, that he had spoken with Jonathan Demme and that Demme had been offered the job of directing Shivers unbeknownst to Cronenberg. It's interesting, too, that Lynn Lowry would then go on to be in Fighting Mad, which I think was the next Jonathan Demme film that was produced after that.
Yeah, I love that story. And I guess that's apparently how Cronenberg met Barbara Steele was at Demi's house. So that's kind of nice little confluence of events there. And that story just reminded me that Cronenberg never ended up going to LA. And I think, again, that's one of those things that threw me off about most of his films. That one thing I couldn't put my finger on that made them feel a little bit different, like something's not quite right here. A lot of the films that I ended up finding out years later were Canadian productions. There was always something, whether it was the climate, maybe it was the cinematography, that always made them feel different without me realizing what that difference was. And again, that can be unnerving and unsettling, unconsciously so, just having no idea other than the subject matter, why this thing is kind of bothering me as I watch it.
I remember I had Paul Carupa on the projection booth one time, and he used to do, and he might still do, a website about Canuxploitation films. And he was talking about the film stock itself was actually different than what we would have here in the U.S. So it was like there was a different look to, or it was processed at one central location. So it always had a different sheen to it than the films that you might get from the U.S. So it was just like, yeah, we actually had a different look to these Canuxploitation films.
But that, I think, is brought up in the book They Came From Within, and I can't for the life of me pronounce that gentleman's name who wrote that. Calum
Von Stahl?
Okay, thank you. Oh, gosh, I wish I could remember the term that he uses in the book to describe it, because it's kind of perfect. Yeah, all that stuff just combines to sort of, when you're a kid from California that has no idea that these films are being made anywhere other than the States or California specifically, it can just seem like, I've never seen a place like this, or things don't look this way to me. It can really settle into your head while you're watching a movie.
Gives you that sense of otherness, and then every once in a while they'll throw in a boot or something, and it's like, oh, now I know where this is filmed.
But if you watch My Bloody Valentine, you will get a lot of that. I think that's just about the most Canadian horror movie there is.
I really love Lynn Lowry in this movie. It always tickles me going back and seeing her during this period of her career, things like when she was in The Crazies or Sugar Cookies, or I absolutely love Radley Metzger's score. It's so nice to see her in these roles, and for me, she's one of the better actresses in the film. She's right up there with Barbara Steele for me as far as just being able to bring that presence, and then she's kind of got this otherworldliness to her. I don't know if it's the almond-shaped eyes or what it is, but she always just looks a little ethereal to me.
She has kind of like a fairy or elfin look. And it is that look, though, too, that sets you up for maybe something a little bit different. Like, is she infected? Is she not infected? That becomes a question in the film. And I think because of her physicality, you sort of wonder, when does it happen? And I wish I could remember which book it was that suggested she was already infected by the time we see her in the doctor's office, when that old man is kind of flirting with her. But I always assumed it was when the security guard attacked her.
Yeah, I've never really thought about it. Though, bringing up that lecherous old man at the doctor's office, I mean, he is hitting on anything with the pulse.
Telling his story about megavitamins to anyone who'll listen.
Yes, that the aging process is in any way reversible, I don't think for a moment that it is, but it might be stoppable, and that's where megavitamins come in.
Oh, yeah. I feel so bad for any woman that sits next to him in that office. Looking at Lynn Lowry's filmography, it's really interesting because I think she has more movies that have been announced and in pre- and post-production than she ever actually shot in her entire life beforehand. I mean, she went through a real fallow period for a little while in I think it was the 90s. And then it was like starting in 2005, she just came screaming back with a vengeance. And now she's got, I would say, at least 30 films that are announced and supposed to be coming out eventually. Who knows in a post-COVID world what's going to happen with this, but...
I just kind of remember her mainly from the 4 cult horror films from the early 70s. I think she has a cameo in the Crazy's remake as well.
And in the Rabid remake too, I think, which I am not rushing out to see anytime.
You know, talking about Laurie, who was one of the more recognizable actors for me at the time, but the only other one I really recognized other than Joe Silver, who I couldn't place, was Barbara Steele. And I like how she's our connection to traditional quote-unquote horror films, because this is not concerned with traditional horror tropes at all. That, again, is probably the main reason why it struck me upon first watch, you know, and still does to this day.
Yeah, that's the thing I like, is that we don't have to sit through all of the experiments making these parasites. We get just enough to hear this whole idea of why parasites, the original intention is to replace an organ with a parasite, make parasites great again, and that it doesn't necessarily go wrong, because I think it goes exactly to the one doctor's plan, not necessarily to Linsky's plan, but to the other ones.
He was screwing them all, I think, or something to that effect that Linsky says.
Anyhow, I've been going through his papers, and what it adds up to is this. Hobbes was shafting us all. Me, the university, the foundations, the council, everybody.
It's just so completely different from anything coming out at the time. Probably the biggest movie in recent years, biggest horror movie, was The Exorcist, and that's supernatural or religious. And, you know, even Rosemary's Baby, which is a really modern film, is about the devil in modern day New York. Or Carrie. That's just something that Cronenberg stuck with throughout the years. And I kind of see The Dead Zone dismissed a little bit because it goes outside of that. But again, that's still not supernatural. That is extra natural. Don't see it as that different from a lot of the other stuff that he was doing at the time.
No, I don't either. And I see Johnny Smith as being very comparable to the other male protagonists that he's had throughout so many of his films. Yeah, I was taking a look at 1975 as far as horror films, genre films, and I mean, it is interesting. Another movie with kids on leashes, Salò, was from the same year. This was the year of Jaws, which plays much more into the whole idea of the creature feature or nature gone wild. I think that was definitely another area of horror that was being explored quite a bit in the 1970s, whether it was, you know, killer bears or, you know, mutant bears or, you know, giant ants, any of these kind of things, rabbits that are attacking you, you know, Dog Day Afternoon, all about the dogs that attack. Oh, wait, no, that's a different movie. 3 Days of the Condor, another animal attack movie. But yeah, no, I mean, there was like Deep Red was happening in Italy, but this wasn't what Cronenberg was doing was definitely very different, I would say.
All about what transpires within somebody's body, and body horror, that term that we've come up with. But I remember, and I think that I had to read through the Psychotronic Encyclopedia of Film to be reminded of the term venereal horror, which was used, you know, much further back than body horror, and really only works maybe for Shivers and Rabid. I kind of like that term, especially for Shivers.
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely very appropriate.
And I guess even in a way you could apply it to Videodrome, even though that's more of something happening with the mind and hallucinations. But it does seem to at least have an effect on the body. And of course, sex is all wrapped up into that movie as well.
Oh, God, yes.
That mixture of sex and violence that intrigued and repulsed me at the same time, which I guess is the perfect way to describe Cronenberg movies. And where you fall on that scale, I guess you're either going to like them or not.
Try to remember that line about the Kramer painting. Oh, God, what is that? Grotesque, but oddly compelling.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's perfect.
He's a loathsome, offensive brute, yet I cannot look away.
We'll probably get into it more on the Brood episode. The whole idea with Cronenberg is the controversy, and since this was his first film and it had controversy from the get-go, that followed all the way through at least Naked Lunch. And I knew nothing about the Canadian tax shelter years. You know, that thought of having public funds put into creative endeavors always seems like a real shaky concept to me.
Well, I'm sure you remember the National Endowment for the Arts, right?
Right.
Didn't really go over too well.
For me, that was sort of the comparable thing. This seems like it was much more pervasive through the Canadian film industry, and it's just kind of a fascinating idea to take taxpayer money. I mean, that was the original idea. Use taxpayer money to fund the arts and start an industry there that didn't really exist, and then it turned into this kind of sleazy Ponzi scheme or something.
It's strange because we somewhat had something similar here in Michigan a few years ago, where it was really trying to offer tax breaks to companies to come in and shoot their films here, and it was doing great guns of business, and then it was just like, nope, we're done with this. We're going to cut, the tax breaks are gone. And we had started to set up an industry. We had a studio that was built in a city nearby, close to the Pontiac Silverdome, and Sam Raimi was shooting stuff there. We had stuff going on the west side of the state. We had all this stuff going on. Then all of a sudden it was like, nope. We had a regime change, and they just ended it all. And so all of these people who had actually been having job training and learning about how to do these jobs in the industry were suddenly just SOL. And it's like, nope, sorry, we're not doing this anymore. If you want to work in this industry, you're going to have to move and leave the state now.
Wasn't that what they kind of do in Georgia? I mean, it seems like everybody's filming in Georgia, and I would assume it has to have something to do with tax incentives.
I'm sure. And I'm sure that back when De Laurentiis was shooting a lot of stuff in North Carolina, I'm sure there was a major tax deal happening there for him. Or I know what it was. There were no unions in North Carolina.
Yeah, and I think that's also why The Evil Dead kept moving down from Michigan all the way down to, where did they end up? Kentucky? Tennessee, one of those two. And I think it was sort of a similar idea, like there's no union representation here, so we don't have to worry about it. Yeah, you start getting into all kinds of shady stuff, and I think The Brood was the last of Cronenberg's films to benefit from the tax shelter money. Whenever you do stuff like that, you're going to get shady dealings. So,
oh yeah, 100% of the time.
Which, of course, wasn't the issue with Shivers. That was more that it bothered people, or it bothered one critic in particular, and enough to write an article with the title that you should know how bad this movie is since you paid for it. It hurt his career for a little while and made it harder for him to get funding throughout the years. So, Cronenberg, that is.
Right, not the critic, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, he even managed to get him kicked out of his house. His landlady read that article and was just like, there's nothing false that comes out in, I don't know, the Star or whatever newspaper it was, and ended up kicking him out of the house. And then he fucked her over and bought the house across the street. Right. So it was just basically a living reminder, hey, I'm the guy that makes dirty movies.
I love that. I love that bit that he got to buy the house across the street. That's
so good.
A sweet ending to that story. So, okay, Mike. Well, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Well, thank you for having me.
And what can the fans of the Projection Booth podcast look forward to for November of 2020?
Well, November is always Noirvember around the Projection Booth, so we are covering some interesting titles this year. The Big Clock, one of my favorite ones. Of course, we'll be talking a little bit about No Way Out, and possibly, and I know this wasn't a remake, but for whatever reason, Out of Time sure feels like they owe the Fearing estate a little bit of money on that. We'll also be talking about Ride the Pink Horse, Friends of Eddie Coyle, and To Live and Die in L.A.
I'm only familiar with a couple of those, so I will have to check the other ones out before the shows come out.
I think at least two of those now are on Criterion. One's on Indicator, and I think Arrow is To Live and Die in L.A. So, and you can find all of that fun stuff over at projectionboothpodcast.com.
And if you want people to find you on social media, where should they look?
Well, it's a horrible Twitter handle that I have, which is ProBoothcast. It sounds like something is wrong with your teeth.
Hey, how about the pickle? It's used.
Another big thanks to Mike White for being on the show. And thanks to all of you for listening. If you are here because of the projection booth, I hope that you hang around for a little bit and check out some more of the episodes. Mike has been on 3 other episodes on Eraserhead, Taxi Driver, and The Evil Dead, so you can find those on my SoundCloud page or on iTunes, and maybe poke around and see if there's anything else that piques your interest. I have had the honor of being on the projection booth, and that is probably out now, an episode on a movie called The Antenna. And I will also be on an episode of the projection booth on Cronenberg's The Brood, which should be out shortly after this one, with Mike and with Sam Deegan. If you are new to the show and you feel like offering up a review or a rating on iTunes, it would be greatly appreciated. Thanks again, everybody, and don't forget,
Anything can happen when you wake up heavy.
Contemplating suicide, but it really doesn't suit my style. So I think I'll just act bored instead, and contain the blood I would have shed. She makes me feel so at ease. My heart is really on its knees, but I keep a poker face so well that even mother couldn't tell. My baby's so vain, she is almost a mirror, and the sound of her name sends a permanent shiver down my spine. Down my spine. I keep a photograph against my heart, for in my life she plays a starring part. All alcohol and cigarettes, there is no room for cheap regret. She makes me feel so
not enough guts.